When we think of Nazi Germany, our minds usually jump to images of armies, of tanks, of military might. But there was another weapon in their arsenal, one that was arguably just as powerful. It was a weapon that conquered minds long before a single shot was ever fired: propaganda. And this wasn't some side project for them. No, this was the very engine of the regime. So in this explainer, we're going to deconstruct that engine piece by powerful piece. And look, there's really no better way to grasp its importance than to hear it straight from the architect himself, Joseph Goebbels. He said it, plain as day. Without the radio, their rise to power, their whole project, would have been impossible. They understood this from the very beginning. If you control the technology, you control the truth. So, where did the blueprint for this massive machine even come from? Well, the really disturbing part is that it was published for the entire world to see years before the Nazis ever seized power. The whole strategy was laid out, right there in black and white, by Adolf Hitler in his book, Mein Kampf. Okay, so principle number 1 is almost jarring in its simplicity. Forget about intellectual arguments. Hitler's core belief was that propaganda had to be aimed at the lowest common denominator. This was never about winning a debate with the smartest people in the room. No, it was about capturing the masses with a message so simple, so basic, that it was literally impossible to misunderstand. And the second principle flows right from that first one. You've got to target emotion, not reason. Hitler's whole bet was that the public is driven by feelings, by sentiment, not by cold, hard logic. So propaganda shouldn't waste a single second on objective facts or complicated arguments. Instead, its job is to paint the world in big, bold, simple strokes. Love versus hate, us versus them, good versus evil. And this quote right here, this gives us the final, absolutely crucial pieces of the strategy. First, you boil everything down to just a few simple slogans. And then you repeat them again and again and again. The goal was to hammer these ideas into the public consciousness until they just became the truth, not because they were proven, but through sheer, relentless repetition. So let's just recap the playbook straight from the source. Number 1, keep it simple and make it emotional. Number 2, aim it at the least intellectual person you can imagine. 3, repeat it relentlessly. And 4, and this one is a big one, never, ever admit the other side might have a point. Present only your side of the truth. This was the foundation for literally everything that came next. Okay, so you've got the playbook, but a playbook's useless without a team, right? Without a machine to actually run the plays. Now we're going to see how the Nazis went from this theory on paper to building a massive state-run apparatus designed to inject these ideas into every single corner of German life. And this thing wasn't built overnight. It was methodical. It started small, with a few party newspapers back in the 1920s. Things got more serious in 1930 when Goebbels was put in charge of the whole operation. But the real game changer, the final critical step, came in 1933. They created a formal government ministry for propaganda. That gave the state absolute, total legal control over every newspaper, every radio station, every film studio. The machine was now complete. And this slide really shows you the night and day difference. Before 1933, they were the outsiders, basically yelling from the sidelines, trying to get attention. But after 1933, they were the system. They didn't have to convince the media to cover them anymore. They were the media. And that gave them a level of message control that was just completely unimaginable before. All right, so the machine is built. It has total control over everything. The next question is pretty obvious. What was this machine actually pumping out day in and day out? What were the German people hearing, seeing, and reading? Well, the messaging was incredibly consistent, and it really focused on a few core ideas. You can think of it as a two-pronged attack. First, you create and demonize a list of enemies, both inside and outside of Germany. And at the same time, you promote this powerful, unifying vision of Nazi ideals. That meant building up the myth of Hitler. It meant calling for all ethnic Germans to be unified. And, of course, it meant making up excuses for war. Let's zero in on this word for a second, Volksgemeinschaft, because it is absolutely crucial. This was the utopian dream they were selling to the German people. A people's community, an idea that all the old divisions of class and social status would just melt away, and what would be left is this perfect society unified by blood and ideology. But here's the insidious catch. A community defined by who's in is, by its very nature, also defined by who is kept out. It was unity through mass exclusion. So how did they deliver all these messages? Well, it wasn't about using just one channel. The strategy was total media saturation. The goal was to create an environment where the Nazi narrative wasn't just another opinion, it was the very air you breathed. And at the top of the list, number one with the bullet, was the radio. Like Goebbels himself said, he saw it as his most vital weapon. It was a direct line from his ministry into the living rooms, kitchens, and workplaces of millions of ordinary Germans. And they made sure everybody was listening. I mean, just look at this number. By the start of World War II, an incredible 70% of German households owned a radio. And that was no accident. The government poured money into subsidizing these cheap people's receivers, which were intentionally designed so they couldn't pick up foreign broadcasts. You could listen, sure, but you were only going to hear their voice. Next up in the arsenal, film. Now, the Nazis didn't just influence the film industry. No, they swallowed it whole. The entire industry was nationalized, effectively turning every single movie theater in the country into an outlet for the state's message. And the most infamous example of this is, of course, Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. This thing wasn't a documentary in any real sense of the word. It was myth-making on a truly epic scale. With these sweeping camera angles, the powerful music, the shots of immense, perfectly orderly crowds. It wasn't just recording a rally. It was manufacturing the myth of Nazi power and destiny right before your eyes. And then you have posters. Think about it. You can turn off a radio, you can walk out of a movie theater. But posters, they're just there. They were a constant, unavoidable part of the visual landscape, shaping public space itself. A perfect example was the Word of the Week poster campaign. You can think of these as giant state-approved memes plastered absolutely everywhere you could imagine. With an estimated 125,000 of them distributed every single week, these bold, simple messages became a relentless, inescapable part of daily German life. Okay, but what happens when your entire propaganda machine is built on strength, on victory, on destiny, and you start losing a war? Well, the message has to change. It has to adapt if it's going to survive. And that pivot point, the clear line in the sand, was the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. Before that battle, all the propaganda was about German invincibility, conquest, glory. But after, the whole story changed. Suddenly, the tone became one of desperate defense. Germany was no longer the all-powerful aggressor. Oh no. Now it was the heroic, lone defender of European civilization against the barbarian hordes from the East. And this just shows the absolute depths of their deception. As rumors about the final solution started to leak out, the regime created an unbelievably elaborate hoax, the Theresienstadt camp. They built a complete facade of a happy, thriving town, with fake cafes, cultural events, sports, and they filmed it all to show the Red Cross in the world. It was all a lie, a movie set. After the cameras left, most of the Jewish prisoners who had been forced to be actors were shipped off to their deaths at Auschwitz. So, in the end, that was the goal, right? All of these tools, the radio, the films, the posters, even these horrifyingly elaborate hoaxes, they all served one single purpose: to build a closed information ecosystem, a bubble, an environment where the state's narrative wasn't just one version of the truth. It was the only reality you were ever allowed to see. So we'll leave you with a question, a pretty stark one. What would a man like Mahatma Gandhi, a man whose entire philosophy was built on nonviolence and what he called truth force, what would he have said to Hitler about all these ideas? You have one worldview built on the absolute power of the lie and another built on the absolute power of truth. It's a contrast that is, well, it's definitely worth thinking about.